Imagine you are standing on the summit of the highest mountain in the world. It is the coldest, most remote, most unreachable place a person can stand. The air is thin, and the wind is bitter, and below you the ridges fall away into cloud, mile upon mile of rock and ice and empty sky. There is nothing above you but the darkening blue of the upper atmosphere and the first faint stars. You are as far from the sea as it is possible to be, nearly 9 kilometers above the level of the oceans, on the very roof of the world. And there, beneath your feet, embedded in the pale gray stone of the summit itself, is a seashell. Not a real shell, of course, not one you could pick up, but a fossil, the trace of a small marine creature that lived and died at the bottom of a warm, shallow sea, and whose remains were pressed into limestone, and then lifted across millions of years all the way up here, to the top of the tallest mountain on Earth. The rock at the summit of that mountain is marine limestone, made from the shells and skeletons of sea creatures, and it holds their fossils, and it was formed on the floor of an ocean. You are standing on the roof of the world, and you are standing on the bottom of a vanished sea. That sea has a name, and it is one of the strangest and most unsettling names in all of geology. It was called the Tethys, and it was one of the greatest oceans that ever existed on this planet. For hundreds of millions of years, it wrapped around the warm heart of the world, a vast tropical ocean between the northern and southern lands, teeming with monsters, cradling the origins of creatures that still exist today. And then it died. It was crushed and swallowed and destroyed, folded up into the highest mountains on Earth and squeezed down into a scatter of dying, poisoned remnant seas. An entire ocean, one of the largest the world has ever known, simply vanished from the face of the planet. And here is the thing that unsettles the scientists who study it, the quiet dread that runs beneath all the careful research and the measured papers. Because the Tethys does not simply teach us about the past. It teaches us something about the nature of the world itself, something we would perhaps rather not know. It teaches us that oceans can die, that mountains were once seas, and that seas can become deserts, and that deserts can flood in an instant. That the map of the world, the solid continents, and the eternal oceans we take for granted, is not permanent at all, but a fleeting arrangement, always shifting, always closing, always being destroyed and remade. The Tethys is the ghost of an ocean, and its ghost is everywhere, and its story is one of the most quietly terrifying in the entire history of our planet. Tonight, we are going to trace that story. We will travel back to the warm and living Tethys and meet the monsters that ruled it. We will watch it die, crushed between colliding continents, lifted into the sky as the highest mountains on Earth. We will witness the day an entire sea dried up into a burning desert, and the flood that refilled it in a geological instant. And we will discover why this vanished ocean still haunts the scientists who study it, why its death is not truly over, and why it whispers, to those who understand it, a truth about the impermanence of the whole world. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. It's always a quiet comfort to see who is joining me from around the world, listening in the dark. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, something like the sound of a tide that has been gone for millions of years. Find your comfortable position. Take a slow, deep breath and let all the weight of the day drain gently away. And let us descend from the roof of the world into the depths of a vanished ocean. To understand the Tethys, you first have to unlearn the map, more completely than for almost any other place in the history of the Earth. Because the Tethys was not a sea in some corner of the world. It was the ocean at the very heart of it, the great tropical gulf around which the whole ancient world was arranged, and for a span of time so vast that it is difficult to hold in the mind. It was one of the defining features of the planet. Travel back a little over 200 million years into the age of the dinosaurs, and you would find a world with a single supercontinent, an enormous landmass called Pangaea, gathering nearly all the world's dry land into one great mass. But Pangaea was not a perfect circle of land. On its eastern side it was open, cut by a vast gulf of ocean that reached deep into the heart of the supercontinent, like an enormous wedge or a great open mouth. That gulf was the Tethys. It separated the northern part of the supercontinent, the lands that would become Europe and Asia and North America, which scientists call Laurasia, from the southern part, the lands that would become Africa and South America and Antarctica and Australia and India, which scientists call Gondwana. Between these two great landmasses, wrapping around the warm equator of the world, lay the Tethys Ocean, warm and vast and ancient. And it was ancient. The Tethys, in one form or another, existed for an astonishingly long time. There had been an earlier ocean in roughly the same region, which scientists call the Paleo-Tethys, the Old Tethys, stretching back deep into the age before the dinosaurs. And then, as the continents shifted and rearranged themselves, a new ocean opened, the Neo-Tethys, the New Tethys, which would become the Great Tethys of the age of dinosaurs. Across the Triassic, the Jurassic, and the Cretaceous, across the entire reign of the dinosaurs and beyond, the Tethys wrapped around the tropical heart of the world, its warm waters connecting the oceans of the planet in a great circling current around the equator. It was there for well over 100 million years, and its precursors stretched back far longer still. It was one of the most enduring features of the ancient Earth. The name Tethys itself has a fittingly ancient and mythological ring. It was given to the ocean in the late 19th century by a great geologist named Eduard Suess, who named it after Tethys, a sea goddess of ancient Greek myth, the sister and wife of the ocean god, mother of the rivers and the sea nymphs. It was a fitting name for a lost primordial ocean, a name drawn from myth for a sea that had vanished before any human being existed to see it. And the name has endured so that this ghost ocean, this vanished sea at the heart of the ancient world, still carries the name of a goddess of the deep. The Tethys was a warm ocean, a tropical ocean, for it lay across the equator of the world, bathed in the heat of the sun. And it was in places a shallow ocean with broad warm shelves and great carbonate platforms where marine life flourished and laid down thick beds of limestone. In other places it was deep, a true ocean basin, with cold, dark depths. It was crossed by currents, ringed by reefs, and it teemed with life, from the tiny drifting plankton to the greatest marine monsters of the age of dinosaurs. It was, for a very long time, one of the richest and most important marine environments on the entire planet, the warm beating heart of the ancient ocean world. And how do we know all this? About an ocean that no longer exists, that was destroyed millions of years before there was anyone to map it. The answer is one of the most remarkable things about the Tethys, and one of the reasons it so unsettles those who study it. Because the Tethys did not vanish without a trace. Its remains are everywhere. Its sediments, laid down on its ancient floor, were lifted up and folded into mountain ranges that stretch across the modern world, from the Alps to the Himalayas. Its limestones form the pale peaks of the Dolomites and the stone of countless buildings. Its remnant seas still exist, dying and shrinking as the Mediterranean and the Black Sea and the Caspian. Its fossils are found on mountain tops and in deserts, and its oil and gas, formed from the organic remains of its teeming life, fuel much of the modern world. The Tethys is gone, and yet it is everywhere, written into the rocks and the seas and the very economy of our civilization. So let us go back to it now, while it was still alive, and see the warm and living ocean at the heart of the ancient world. But before we do, it is worth pausing on a deeper question, one that touches the very heart of why the Tethys unsettles those who study it. How can anyone reconstruct an ocean that no longer exists? How do you map a sea whose floor was swallowed by the earth, whose waters are gone, whose very existence must be inferred from scattered clues? The answer is a story of remarkable scientific detective work, and of the deep uncertainties that haunt it. To reconstruct the Tethys is to perform one of the most difficult feats in all of science, the reconstruction of an ocean that has been destroyed. For when an ocean dies, when its floor is subducted, driven down into the earth and melted away, the primary evidence of its existence is consumed. The ocean floor, which would tell us the ocean's age and shape and history, is gone, swallowed by the planet. And so the scientists who study the Tethys must work like detectives at a crime scene from which the body has been removed, piecing together the story from fragments, from indirect clues, from the scattered and partial evidence that survived the destruction. It is painstaking work, and it is never complete, and it is shadowed always by uncertainty. Some of the most important clues are strange pieces of rock called ophiolites. When an ocean closes and its floor is mostly subducted, occasionally a fragment of that ocean floor is not driven down into the earth, but is instead scraped off and thrust up onto the edge of a continent, preserved, caught in the collision. These preserved fragments of ancient ocean floor are the ophiolites, and they are precious beyond measure to the scientists who study vanished oceans, for they are actual pieces of the lost sea floor, survivors of the destruction. By studying the ophiolites scattered along the Great Belt where the Tethys once lay, from the Alps to the Middle East to the Himalayas, scientists can learn about the ocean floor that has otherwise been consumed, reading in these fragments the story of the vanished sea. Each ophiolite is a bone of the dead ocean, a surviving fragment from which the whole vanished sea must be reconstructed. Other clues come from the sediments that were laid down on the floor and margins of the Tethys, and then lifted and folded into the mountains as the ocean closed. These sediments, now turned to rock and thrust into the great mountain ranges, preserve a record of the conditions in the ancient sea, of its depth and temperature and chemistry, of the creatures that lived in it. By studying these rocks and the fossils they contain, scientists can reconstruct the environments of the Tethys, the warm shallow shelves and the deep basins, the reefs and the open waters. And from the fossils, from the distribution of ancient creatures across the rocks that were once the Tethys, scientists can trace the connections and the barriers within the vanished ocean, mapping how life spread through it, and how the ocean changed over time. Still other clues come from the rocks of the continents themselves, which preserve, in their magnetism and their structure, a record of where they have been. Ancient rocks can preserve a faint record of the Earth's magnetic field at the time they formed, and from this, scientists can work out the latitude at which the rocks lay when they were made. By reading this record in the rocks of the continents that once bordered the Tethys, scientists can reconstruct the ancient positions of those continents, tracing the long, slow drift of Africa and Arabia and India northward across the Tethys, and reconstructing, step by step, the closing of the vanished sea. It is an extraordinary feat, the reconstruction of the ancient dance of the continents from the faint magnetic memories locked in the stones. But for all this remarkable detective work, the reconstruction of the Tethys remains deeply uncertain, and this uncertainty is part of what makes it so haunting. Because so much of the evidence was destroyed when the ocean was consumed, there is much about the Tethys that we do not know and may never know. The exact shape of the ocean at different times, the precise positions of the continents, the details of the currents and the climate, the full diversity of the life, all of these remain in significant part uncertain, reconstructed from fragments, debated among scientists, revised as new evidence emerges. There were, as we understand it, not one simple Tethys but a complex and changing succession of seas and basins, opening and closing, shifting and rearranging, across hundreds of millions of years, and untangling this complexity is a formidable challenge. This is truly the Tethys as we understand it, a vanished ocean reconstructed from its scattered bones, its full story lost with its consumed floor, glimpsed only partially through the surviving clues. And there is a kind of vertigo in that, in the knowledge that an entire ocean, one of the greatest in the history of the planet, has been so nearly erased that we must struggle to reconstruct even its basic outlines. The Tethys is not only a vanished ocean. It is a nearly vanished memory, and recovering even a part of it is one of the great achievements and the great humbling challenges of the science of the Earth. Now, having understood how we know what we know, let us go back to the warm and living sea itself. Before it became a ghost, before it was crushed into mountains and dried into deserts, the Tethys was one of the most vibrant and living oceans the world has ever known. To descend into its warm tropical waters, in the age of the dinosaurs, would have been to enter a sea overflowing with life. A warm blue and green world of reefs and open water and teeming multitudes, ruled by some of the most magnificent monsters that have ever swum. The Tethys was, above all, a warm ocean, and its warmth was the foundation of its richness. Lying across the tropics of the ancient world, bathed in sunlight, its shallow margins were among the most productive marine environments on the planet. Along its edges spread great carbonate platforms, broad shallow shelves where tiny organisms and corals and shelled creatures laid down calcium carbonate, year after year, for millions of years, building up thick beds of limestone. These warm shallow shelves were crowded with life, with reefs and shellfish and swimming creatures, and they were the cradle of the great limestone formations that would one day become the pale mountains of southern Europe. When you look at the white limestone peaks of the Dolomites in Italy, you are looking at the fossilized floor of the Tethys. The ancient reefs and shelves of that warm tropical sea, lifted up into the sky and turned to stone. The open waters of the Tethys were crossed by currents that connected it to the oceans of the whole world. Because the Tethys wrapped around the equator, and because the continents were arranged in a particular way, warm water could flow around the tropical heart of the planet in a great circling current, passing through the Tethys and around the world. This circumequatorial current, this great warm river in the sea, helped to distribute heat around the planet, keeping the ancient world warm and mild, free of the great ice caps that grip the poles today. The Tethys was not just a sea in itself. It was a crucial part of the whole planet's system of ocean currents and climate, a warm artery at the heart of the ancient world. And the Tethys teemed with life. Its waters were full of ammonites, the coiled-shelled cephalopods that thronged the ancient seas in enormous variety, from small forms to giants. Its waters held belemnites, the squid-like creatures with internal bullet-shaped shells, and countless fish and sharks and shelled creatures of every kind. Its reefs sheltered a vast diversity of life. And through its warm waters swam the great marine reptiles of the age of dinosaurs, the ichthyosaurs and the plesiosaurs and the pliosaurs, and later the mosasaurs, some of the most formidable predators the seas have ever produced. The Tethys was, in its prime, a warm and living paradise of a sea, one of the great arenas of marine life in the whole history of the planet. There is something poignant in picturing it now, knowing what we know of its fate. This warm and teeming ocean, this vibrant tropical sea full of monsters and reefs and life, would one day be utterly destroyed, crushed between colliding continents, lifted into frozen mountains, dried into burning deserts, reduced to a scatter of dying remnant seas. But for now, in the age of the dinosaurs, it was alive, warm and blue and green, wrapping around the heart of the world, ruled by monsters. Let us meet those monsters now, the great predators of the Tethys, before we turn to the ocean's long and terrible death. The Tethys, in the age of the dinosaurs, was ruled by monsters, and they were among the most magnificent and terrible predators that have ever swum in any sea. For while the dinosaurs walked the lands around the Tethys, the warm waters of the ocean itself belonged to the great marine reptiles, creatures that had returned to the sea and been reshaped into superb ocean predators, and the Tethys was one of their great domains. The most elegant of them were the ichthyosaurs, marine reptiles that had, across millions of years, evolved into a form astonishingly like that of a dolphin, sleek and streamlined and fast, with long toothed jaws and large eyes and powerful tails. The ichthyosaurs were superb swimmers, fast pursuit predators that hunted fish and squid and ammonites through the open waters of the Tethys. Some of them had enormous eyes, among the largest eyes of any animal known, suggesting that they dived deep into the dim waters to hunt, gathering the faint light of the depths. They were creatures perfectly at home in the sea, giving birth to live young in the water, never needing to return to land, cruising the warm Tethys as some of its swiftest and most graceful hunters. Alongside them swam the plesiosaurs, with their barrel-shaped bodies and their four great wing-like flippers, flying through the water in a motion more like a penguin or a sea turtle than a fish. Some of the plesiosaurs had long, snaking necks, tipped with small heads, which they used to reach into shoals of fish. And some had taken a very different and far more terrifying form. These were the pliosaurs, the short-necked giants, with enormous heads and powerful jaws, some of them among the most fearsome predators the seas have ever known. A great pliosaur could have a skull 2 meters long or more, armed with huge teeth, and a bite of tremendous crushing force, capable of seizing and killing other large marine reptiles. These were the apex predators of the Jurassic Tethys, the great devourers, cruising the warm water in search of prey, and to meet one would have been to meet a set of jaws large enough to seize almost anything else in the sea. The remains of these great pliosaurs have been found in the rocks that were once the floor and margins of the Tethys and its connected seas, scattered across what is now Europe and beyond. Some of them were true giants, and the discovery of their enormous skulls and teeth has revealed just how formidable the predators of the Tethys could be. These were monsters in the fullest sense, apex hunters of enormous size and terrible power, ruling the warm ocean at the heart of the ancient world. And in the later part of the age of dinosaurs, as the Tethys continued to wrap around the warming world, new monsters rose to rule its waters. The mosasaurs appeared, the great sea lizards, relatives of the monitor lizards and snakes, which had returned to the sea and grown into enormous predators, some reaching lengths of over a dozen meters. With their long, powerful bodies and their double-hinged jaws lined with backward-curving teeth, the mosasaurs became the apex predators of the late Cretaceous seas, including the Tethys, hunting fish and turtles and ammonites and one another. They were the last great marine reptile rulers of the Tethys, cruising its warm waters in the final age of the dinosaurs, before the great catastrophe that would end that age forever. The monsters of the Tethys were among the grandest predators in the history of the sea, and the warm ocean at the heart of the ancient world was one of their great arenas. But the reptiles were not the only remarkable creatures of the Tethys. Cruising its waters were hunters stranger still, creatures that had taken the form of the sea in ways that seem almost impossible, and its waters thronged with shelled multitudes beyond counting. Let us continue our exploration of the living Tethys. Beyond the great marine reptiles, the Tethys held other hunters, and some of them were among the strangest creatures ever to have taken to the sea. For the Tethys was a place of evolutionary experiment, a warm ocean where many different lineages of animals had returned to the water and been reshaped by it. And among the most remarkable were the sea crocodiles, creatures that had transformed the familiar body of the crocodile into something built entirely for the open ocean. These were the marine crocodiles, a group of ancient crocodile relatives that, in the Jurassic Tethys, had evolved into fully aquatic ocean predators, unlike any crocodile alive today. The crocodiles, are creatures of rivers and swamps and coasts, with armored bodies and clawed feet, ambush predators of the water's edge. But the marine crocodiles of the Tethys had gone much further. They had lost their heavy armor, and their bodies had become smooth and streamlined. Their feet had become paddles or even flippers, and most remarkably of all, their tails had developed a fin, a downturned fluke at the end, like the tail of a fish or a shark, to drive them through the open water. These were crocodiles that had become sea dragons, fully committed to the ocean, cruising the warm Tethys as fast and capable marine hunters. Some had slender jaws lined with sharp teeth for seizing fish. Others had become larger, more powerful predators, with robust skulls and cutting teeth, capable of taking large prey. They were a wonderful and strange example of how completely the Tethys could reshape the creatures that entered it, taking the ancient body of the crocodile and remaking it into a creature of the open sea. And the Tethys thronged with shelled life beyond counting, above all with the ammonites. The ammonites were cephalopods, relatives of the squid and octopus and nautilus, but they lived inside coiled shells, often beautifully ribbed and ornamented, from which they extended their tentacled bodies to feed and swim. They filled the Tethys in enormous variety and staggering numbers, from small forms to giants whose shells could grow to great size. They drifted and swam through the warm water, feeding and being fed upon, and when they died, their shells sank to the floor and were preserved in the sediments, so that today the ammonites are among the most characteristic and beautiful fossils of the rocks that were once the Tethys. To hold a coiled ammonite shell, turned to stone or to shimmering mineral, is to hold a creature that drifted through the warm Tethys in the age of dinosaurs, one of the countless multitudes that filled that vanished sea. Alongside the ammonites swam the belemnites, squid-like creatures with hard internal shells shaped like bullets, which are also found in great numbers in the Tethyan rocks. There were fish of many kinds, and sharks cruising the warm water, and shelled creatures carpeting the floor, and reefs sheltering an immense diversity of life. The Tethys was a full and living ocean, rich at every level, from the tiny plankton drifting in the sunlit surface to the great predators cruising the depths. It was one of the great living seas in the history of the planet. But the Tethys was not only the ocean of the dinosaurs. It endured beyond the age of dinosaurs, into the age that followed, the age of mammals, and in that later time it became the setting for one of the most extraordinary and haunting stories in the history of life, a story that connects the vanished ocean to a desert full of whales. Let us follow the Tethys into its later years and meet the creatures that arose along its warm shores. As the age of dinosaurs ended and the age of mammals began, the Tethys was still there, still wrapping around the warm heart of the world, though it was beginning slowly to change. And along its warm shores, in the time we call the Eocene, tens of millions of years ago, one of the most remarkable transformations in the history of life was taking place. On the margins of the Tethys, a group of land mammals was returning to the sea and beginning the long transformation that would turn them into the whales. The story of the whales begins on land, with four-legged mammals living along the warm shores and rivers of the Tethyan region, in what is now Pakistan and India and the surrounding lands, which were then the shores of the Tethys. These early ancestors of the whales were creatures that hunted in and around the water, and across millions of years, generation by generation, they became more and more aquatic. Their legs shortened and changed. Their bodies became streamlined. Their nostrils began to migrate toward the top of the head to become the blowhole. And step by step, they left the land behind and committed themselves to the sea, becoming the first true whales. This great transformation, one of the most dramatic in the history of mammals, took place along the warm shores of the Tethys. The whales, in a very real sense, were born in the Tethys. And by the later Eocene, the descendants of these early whales had become enormous. There was a creature called Basilosaurus, a fully aquatic whale, but unlike the whales of today, for it had a long, serpentine, eel-like body, reaching perhaps 18 meters in length, and it still bore tiny, vestigial hind legs, the last remnants of its land-dwelling ancestry, now far too small to be of any use for walking. Basilosaurus was a great predator of the Tethyan seas, cruising the warm water with its long body, hunting fish and other creatures. And it swam in a part of the Tethys that would one day become one of the strangest and most haunting places on Earth. Because in the desert of Egypt, in a remote and arid valley far from any sea, there is a place that has come to be called the Valley of the Whales. It is a barren landscape of sand and rock, blasted by the sun, one of the driest and most desolate places imaginable, and there is no ocean anywhere near it. And yet the desert floor there is scattered with the skeletons of whales. Dozens upon dozens of them, the fossilized remains of Basilosaurus and other ancient whales, lying in the sand, perfectly preserved, in a place where no whale could possibly live. Because this desert, tens of millions of years ago, was the floor of the Tethys. It was a warm, shallow sea where these ancient whales swam and hunted and died, and where their bodies settled into the sediment and were preserved. And then the Tethys retreated, and the sea became land, and the land became desert, and now the whales lie in the sand, in a valley in the middle of the Sahara, the bones of sea creatures in one of the driest places on Earth. There are few images more haunting, more perfectly capturing the strangeness of the Tethys and its fate, than a desert full of whales. It is a place where you can walk among the skeletons of great sea creatures, under a blazing desert sun, with no water in sight for 100 miles, and know that you are walking on the floor of a vanished ocean. It is a monument to the impermanence of the world, to the way that seas can become deserts and the floor of the ocean can become the burning sand. And it is a first, quiet hint of the deeper terror of the Tethys, the terror that we must now begin to confront directly. Because the Tethys did not simply retreat, it was destroyed. An entire ocean was consumed. And the story of how that happened and what it means is one of the most unsettling in all of science. We come now to the heart of the matter, to the reason the Tethys still unsettles the scientists who study it. Because everything we have described so far, the warm living ocean, the monsters, the whales, is gone. Completely gone. The Tethys, one of the greatest oceans in the history of the planet, no longer exists. It was destroyed utterly, and the manner of its destruction reveals a truth about the world that is, when you truly grasp it, deeply disturbing. An ocean can die. An entire ocean can be consumed and vanish from the face of the earth. To understand how, you have to understand the slow, relentless engine that drives the surface of our planet, the movement of the great plates of the Earth's crust. The outer shell of the Earth is not a single solid thing, but is broken into enormous plates which drift endlessly, driven by the churning heat of the planet's interior. These plates carry the continents and the ocean floors upon their backs, and as they move, the map of the world slowly, ceaselessly changes. Continents drift apart and new oceans open between them. Continents drift together, and the oceans between them close. This is the deep rhythm of the planet, playing out over tens and hundreds of millions of years, too slow for any creature to perceive, but utterly transformative over the vast spans of geological time. And the Tethys was caught in the closing. For across the age of dinosaurs and beyond, the great southern lands of Gondwana were breaking apart and their pieces were drifting northward. Africa was moving north. Arabia was moving north. And most dramatically of all, the great landmass of India, which had broken away from the southern continents, was racing northward across the Tethys, driving toward the underbelly of Asia. As these southern lands moved north, they closed the Tethys before them, like a great vice slowly tightening. The ocean that had wrapped around the heart of the world was being squeezed, narrowed, consumed, as the continents to its north and south drove together. The mechanism by which an ocean is consumed is called subduction, and it is one of the most powerful and terrible processes on the planet. Where two plates collide and one carries ocean floor, the dense ocean floor is driven down beneath the other plate, plunging back into the hot depths of the earth, where it is swallowed and destroyed. As the continents around the Tethys drove together, the floor of the Tethys was subducted, driven down into the earth, consumed, plate by plate, across millions of years. The ocean was, quite literally, swallowed by the planet, its floor plunging back into the depths from which all ocean crust ultimately comes. And as the ocean floor was consumed, the continents drew closer and closer until at last they collided. This is the terrifying truth at the heart of the Tethys. An ocean is not permanent. An ocean can be closed, squeezed shut between colliding continents, its floor swallowed back into the earth, until nothing of it remains but crushed sediments and a scatter of trapped remnant seas. The Tethys, one of the greatest oceans that ever existed, was destroyed in exactly this way, consumed by the slow collision of the continents, swallowed by the planet itself. And when the continents finally collided, when Africa and Arabia and India drove at last into the underbelly of Eurasia, the crushed remains of the Tethys were not simply buried. They were lifted, folded, thrust upward into the sky, raised into the highest mountains on the face of the earth. The floor of the vanished ocean became the roof of the world. And to that astonishing and unsettling fact, we now must turn. When India, after its long northward journey across the dying Tethys, finally collided with Asia, the impact was one of the most consequential events in the recent history of the planet. It was not a sudden crash, for these things happen over millions of years, but it was a collision nonetheless. Two great masses of continental crust driving into one another with unimaginable, relentless force. And when continents collide, the crust between them has nowhere to go but up. It buckles and folds and thrusts upward, piling into mountains. And the collision of India with Asia raised the greatest mountains on Earth, the Himalayas, and the vast high plateau of Tibet behind them. But here is the thing that makes the Himalayas so much more than mountains, the thing that makes them a monument to the vanished Tethys and a source of quiet terror to those who understand them. The rock that was lifted up to form these mountains was, in large part, the floor of the Tethys. The sediments that had accumulated on the bottom of that warm ocean, the limestones formed from its reefs and its shelled multitudes, the deep-sea muds laid down in its depths, all of this was caught between the colliding continents and thrust upward, folded and crumpled and raised into the sky. The Himalayas are, in a very real sense, the crushed and lifted corpse of the Tethys Ocean. The highest mountains on Earth are made, in significant part, from the floor of a vanished sea. This is why, at the very summit of the highest mountain in the world, there is marine limestone, full of the fossils of sea creatures. The rock at the top of that mountain was formed on the floor of the Tethys, in a warm, shallow sea, from the remains of marine organisms. And then it was lifted, across millions of years, all the way up to the roof of the world, nearly 9 kilometers above the level of the oceans. The creatures whose shells make up that summit limestone lived at the bottom of the sea, and now their fossils sit at the top of the world, higher than any other rock on the planet. The bottom of the ocean has become the roof of the world. When climbers stand on that summit, gasping in the thin, frozen air, they are standing on the fossilized floor of a tropical sea that vanished millions of years ago. There is something in this that reaches beyond mere scientific interest, something that touches on a deep and unsettling truth. Because the mountains feel like the most permanent things in the world. They are the very symbol of permanence and solidity and endurance. And yet the greatest mountains on Earth were once the floor of an ocean, lifted into the sky by the slow collision of continents. The solid, eternal, unmovable mountains are, in truth, the crushed remains of a vanished sea, raised up by forces still at work today. If the bottom of an ocean can become the roof of the world, then nothing about the map of the planet is permanent. The mountains will not last. The oceans will not last. The very arrangement of the continents is temporary, always shifting, always being destroyed and remade. This is part of what the Tethys teaches, and part of why it unsettles those who truly grasp it. It reveals the impermanence of even the most seemingly eternal features of the world, and the collision that raised the Himalayas is not finished. India is still driving northward into Asia, still pushing, still raising the mountains higher, still crumpling the crust. The Himalayas are still growing, and the collision that destroyed the Tethys is still underway. The death of the ocean is not a finished event, safely locked in the past. It is ongoing, right now, beneath our feet, in the slow, relentless collision of the continents. And that ongoing death has consequences, terrible consequences that reach into the human world today. But before we turn to those, we must witness the single most astonishing event in the death of the Tethys, an event so strange that when scientists first proposed it, many refused to believe it. We must witness the day that an entire sea dried up. Of all the strange and terrible events in the long death of the Tethys, none is more astonishing, more difficult to believe than what happened to its western remnant, the sea we now call the Mediterranean, around 6 million years ago. Because around that time, as far as scientists have been able to reconstruct it, the entire Mediterranean Sea dried up. Not partially, not in some small corner. The whole sea, one of the largest bodies of water in the region, very nearly vanished, becoming a vast, deep, burning desert basin, kilometers below the level of the surrounding oceans. It is one of the most extraordinary events in the recent history of the planet, and scientists call it the Messinian salinity crisis. To understand how it happened, you have to understand that by 6 million years ago, the Tethys had already largely closed. The great ocean was gone, consumed by the collision of the continents, and all that remained in the west was the Mediterranean, a large remnant sea, connected to the wider Atlantic Ocean only through a narrow gateway in the region of what is now the Strait of Gibraltar. As long as that gateway remained open, water from the Atlantic could flow in, keeping the Mediterranean full and connected to the world ocean. But the continents were still moving, still colliding, and around 6 million years ago, the gateway closed. The land rose or the sea level shifted, and the narrow connection between the Mediterranean and the Atlantic was cut off. And the Mediterranean was left isolated, a great sea sealed off from the world ocean. And here the terrible logic of the climate took over. Because the Mediterranean lies in a warm, dry part of the world, where the sun evaporates water from the sea faster than the rivers can replace it. As long as the gateway to the Atlantic was open, this did not matter, for the evaporated water was constantly replaced by inflow from the ocean. But once the gateway was closed, there was nothing to replace the water that the sun evaporated away. And so the Mediterranean began to dry up. Slowly at first, then faster, the sea shrank, its level dropping, its shorelines retreating, the water evaporating into the hot, dry air. And as the water evaporated, the salts dissolved in it were left behind, concentrating in the shrinking sea, until the remaining water became a thick, salty brine. And then the salt itself began to crystallize and settle to the bottom in vast quantities. Across perhaps some hundreds of thousands of years, in a series of cycles of drying, the Mediterranean was transformed into something almost unimaginable. The sea level dropped by kilometers until the basin lay far below the level of the surrounding oceans, a vast, deep, sunken desert. Where there had been a sea, there was now a burning, salt-crusted wasteland, thousands of meters below sea level, one of the hottest and most desolate places the planet has ever known. The great rivers that flowed into the Mediterranean, finding the sea gone and the basin dropped far below, cut deep canyons into the exposed land as they raced down toward the distant floor of the empty basin. The Nile carved a vast gorge, deeper in places than the Grand Canyon, as it cut down toward the vanished sea. Beneath the modern city of Cairo, and beneath the modern Mediterranean, these ancient buried canyons still exist, cut when the sea dried up and the rivers plunged toward the empty deep. It is almost impossible to picture an entire sea gone. In its place, a deep desert basin kilometers below sea level, blazing under the sun, crusted with salt, crossed by rivers cutting deep gorges toward the sunken floor. When scientists first found the evidence for this, the thick beds of salt buried beneath the Mediterranean seafloor and reconstructed what they meant, many found it hard to believe. It seemed too extreme, too strange that an entire sea could simply dry up. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the conclusion, as we understand it, is now widely accepted. Around 6 million years ago, the Mediterranean, the last great remnant of the western Tethys, dried up almost completely, becoming a vast, deep, salt-crusted desert. And it left behind something beneath the modern sea, something so vast and so strange that it, too, unsettles the scientists who study it. It left behind a giant made of salt. When the Mediterranean dried up during the Messinian salinity crisis, all the salt that had been dissolved in that vast body of water was left behind, and there was a very great deal of it. A sea holds an enormous quantity of dissolved salt, and when that sea evaporates, the salt does not disappear. It settles to the bottom, layer upon layer, forming thick beds of solid salt. And in the case of the Mediterranean, drying up over many cycles across hundreds of thousands of years, the quantity of salt left behind was staggering. Buried beneath the floor of the modern Mediterranean Sea lie layers of salt up to kilometers thick, an immense deposit of solid salt, laid down when the sea dried up. Scientists call such a deposit a salt giant. The scale of this salt giant is difficult to comprehend. It represents a volume of salt so vast that it amounts to a significant fraction of all the salt dissolved in all the world's oceans. When the Mediterranean dried up and locked all that salt away in the beds beneath its floor, it actually changed, slightly but measurably. the saltiness of the entire world ocean by removing so much salt from the global system. The drying of one remnant sea affected the chemistry of every ocean on the planet. That is how much salt there was, buried beneath the Mediterranean, a giant made of the crystallized remains of a vanished sea. And this salt giant is not merely a curiosity. It is, in various ways, a source of unease and fascination to the scientists who study it. For one thing, its very existence testifies to the extremity of what happened, to the almost unbelievable event of an entire sea drying up. For another, salt giants like this one are associated, in the geological record, with times of great environmental disruption, with disturbances to the climate and the chemistry of the planet. The formation of such a vast quantity of salt in a geologically short time represents a profound perturbation of the Earth's systems, and understanding it, and what it means, remains a challenge. And there is the sheer physical strangeness of it, a layer of solid salt kilometers thick buried beneath a modern sea, affecting the geology of the whole region, deforming and flowing over time in strange ways, influencing the structure of the seafloor above it. The salt giant beneath the Mediterranean is a monument to one of the strangest events in the history of the planet, the drying of a sea. It lies there still, buried beneath the blue waters of the modern Mediterranean, a vast hidden deposit of crystallized salt, the ghost of a sea that evaporated into the sky 6 million years ago. And it is a reminder, a warning almost, of how extreme the fate of a remnant sea can be, of how completely a body of water can vanish, leaving behind only its salt. But the story of the Messinian crisis does not end with the drying and the salt, because the Mediterranean did not remain a desert forever. The sea came back, and the manner of its return was, if anything, even more astonishing than its disappearance. It came back in a flood. For perhaps some hundreds of thousands of years, the Mediterranean basin lay dry, a vast sunken desert kilometers below sea level, crusted with salt, blazing under the sun. But the forces that had closed the gateway to the Atlantic were still at work, still shifting the land and the sea. And eventually, around 5.25 million years ago, the gateway opened again. The barrier at the western end in the region of Gibraltar gave way, and the Atlantic Ocean, held back for so long, came pouring into the empty Mediterranean basin. And what followed was, as we understand it, one of the largest and most dramatic floods in the entire history of the Earth. Consider the situation. On one side, the vast Atlantic Ocean at its normal level. On the other side, the empty Mediterranean basin, a desert kilometers below sea level. And between them, a barrier that had just given way. The water of the Atlantic began to pour through the breach, down into the sunken basin, and as it poured, it cut and eroded the barrier, widening the channel, letting more water through, which cut the channel deeper still, which let even more water through. It was a runaway process, feeding on itself, growing more violent by the hour. And the water thundered down into the empty basin in a cataract beyond imagining, a waterfall or a great rushing flood on a scale the world has rarely if ever seen. The numbers, as scientists have tried to reconstruct them, are almost beyond belief. The flow of water pouring into the Mediterranean may have been 1,000 times greater than the flow of the largest rivers on Earth today. The water in the basin may have risen at a rate of many meters per day, at the peak perhaps rising by more than 10 meters in a single day, the entire Mediterranean filling not over centuries or millennia, but possibly in a matter of months to a few years. An entire sea, one of the largest bodies of water in the region, refilled in a geological instant, in a single catastrophic flood, as the Atlantic thundered down into the empty basin. Scientists call this the Zanclean flood, and it may have been one of the most violent single events in the recent history of the planet. Try to picture it, though it is almost impossible. The empty desert basin, kilometers deep, and into it at the western end, a wall of water pouring in from the Atlantic, a cataract of unimaginable scale, roaring down into the depths, spreading across the basin floor, rising day by day, meter by meter, drowning the salt flats and the buried canyons and the deep desert, refilling the sea. Whatever life had colonized the dry basin, whatever had come to live in that strange sunken desert, was overwhelmed in the flood. And the Mediterranean, which had been a desert, became a sea again, filled in a rush of water so violent and so vast that it stands as one of the great catastrophes in the history of the planet. In a geological blink, the desert became an ocean once more. This is the terror and the wonder of the Messinian salinity crisis, the drying and the refilling of the Mediterranean. An entire sea vanished, becoming a burning desert, and then an entire sea returned in a catastrophic flood. It happened in the recent geological past, long after the dinosaurs, at a time when the ancestors of humans were already walking the earth in Africa. And it reveals, once again, the astonishing impermanence and violence of the world, the way that seas can vanish and return, that the map of the planet is not fixed but subject to sudden and catastrophic change. The scientists who study the Messinian crisis are studying one of the most extreme events the planet has ever undergone, and it is one more reason the Tethys and its remnants continue to unsettle those who understand them. But there is another reason, a more immediate and more frightening one. Because the death of the Tethys is not over, and in its death throes it still kills. Everything we have described so far, the closing of the Tethys, the raising of the Himalayas, the drying and flooding of the Mediterranean, might seem to belong safely to the past, to the deep history of the planet, remote from the human world. But this is the most unsettling truth of all about the Tethys. Its death is not finished. The collision of the continents that destroyed it is still underway, right now, beneath our feet. And in the ongoing agony of that collision, the dying Tethys still reaches into the human world and it still kills. Consider where the collision of the continents is happening. Africa is still driving northward into Europe. Arabia is still pushing into Asia. India is still ramming into the underbelly of the continent, raising the Himalayas higher. And all along this great line of collision, this vast belt where the continents are grinding together and the last of the Tethys is being consumed, the earth is in torment. The crust is being crushed and folded and thrust upward and torn. And where the crust is under such stress, it releases that stress in the most violent ways the planet knows. In earthquakes and in volcanoes. The great belt of collision that marks the death of the Tethys, stretching from the Mediterranean across the Middle East and into the Himalayas, is one of the most seismically active regions on the entire planet. The earthquakes that strike Turkey, that have leveled cities and killed tens of thousands of people, are a product of this collision, of the grinding of the continents as the last of the Tethys is consumed. The earthquakes of Iran, of Afghanistan, of the whole vast region, are the death throes of the vanished ocean, the release of the stress built up as the continents drive together. And the Himalayan region, where India rams into Asia, is racked by great earthquakes, sudden violent releases of the strain built up in the colliding crust, which have devastated the mountain nations and killed many thousands. Every one of these disasters, every earthquake that strikes along this great belt, is, in a sense, the dying Tethys, still convulsing, still reaching into the human world with its terrible power. And the volcanoes. Along the belt of collision, where the crust is being consumed and melted, molten rock rises toward the surface, and volcanoes are born. The Mediterranean region, the heart of the western Tethys, is dotted with volcanoes, some of them among the most famous and most deadly in human history. These are not random. They are a consequence of the tectonic turmoil left by the closing of the Tethys, the melting and rising of rock along the belt where the continents collide. The dying ocean gave birth to a ring of fire around the Mediterranean, volcanoes that have shaped and destroyed, and ended human lives and human civilizations throughout recorded history. And to those volcanoes and the human catastrophes they have caused, we must now turn, for they are among the most vivid and terrible ways that the dying Tethys still touches the human world. The volcanoes born from the death of the Tethys are among the most famous and most deadly in all of human history, and their stories reveal, more vividly than any statistic, how the dying ocean still reaches into the human world. For these are not remote volcanoes in some empty wilderness. They rise in the heart of the ancient Mediterranean world, the cradle of civilizations, and they have shaped human history through catastrophe and terror. Consider the volcano that looms over the Bay of Naples in Italy, Mount Vesuvius. It is a product of the tectonic turmoil left by the closing of the Tethys, the rising of molten rock along the belt where Africa drives into Europe. And in the year 79 of the Common Era, it erupted with catastrophic violence, burying the Roman cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum under ash and rock, killing thousands, preserving the cities and their victims in a moment of sudden death that still haunts us 2,000 years later. The people of Pompeii, going about their daily lives in a Roman city, were killed by the dying Tethys, by a volcano born of the collision that consumed the ancient ocean. And Vesuvius is not extinct. It looms still over the city of Naples, over millions of people, a sleeping giant that will one day wake again, one of the most dangerous volcanoes in the world, a continuing threat born of the death of the Tethys. Consider, too, the volcano of Etna on the island of Sicily, one of the most active volcanoes on the planet, endlessly erupting, born of the same tectonic turmoil. And consider, most dramatically of all, the volcano of Santorini in the Aegean Sea, which produced one of the largest and most consequential eruptions in all of human history. Around 3,500 years ago, in the Bronze Age, the volcano of Santorini, which was then a large island, erupted with almost unimaginable violence, in a blast so enormous that it blew the heart out of the island, leaving only a ring of cliffs around a flooded caldera. The eruption devastated the surrounding region, and it struck a terrible blow against one of the great early civilizations of the Mediterranean, the Minoan civilization of Crete and the Aegean, which went into decline in the centuries that followed. The eruption buried a Minoan town under ash, preserving it, and its memory may echo down through the ages in the myths and legends of a great civilization destroyed by the sea, perhaps even in the ancient story of Atlantis, the great island that sank beneath the waves. The dying Tethys, through the volcano of Santorini, may have helped to end a civilization and to give birth to one of the most enduring myths in human history. These volcanoes, Vesuvius and Etna and Santorini, and the others that ring the Mediterranean, are the fire born of the death of the Tethys. They are the consequence of the collision that consumed the ancient ocean, the molten rock rising along the belt where the continents grind together. And they have shaped human history through terror and catastrophe, burying cities, ending civilizations, giving birth to myths. They are still active, still dangerous, still capable of catastrophe. The dying Tethys is not a remote event of the deep past. It is a present and continuing force, reaching into the human world through fire and earthquake, and it will continue to do so for as long as the continents keep colliding, which is to say, for a very long time to come. But the fire is not the only unsettling legacy of the dying ocean. There is also the poison in the depths of one of its strangest remnant seas. Let us descend into the dead waters of the Black Sea. Among the remnants of the vanished Tethys, scattered across the region where the great ocean once wrapped around the world, there is one that is stranger and more unsettling than all the rest. It is the Black Sea, a large body of water between Europe and Asia, and it holds a dark and poisonous secret in its depths, a secret that makes it one of the most eerie bodies of water on the entire planet. The Black Sea is a remnant of the complex system of seas left behind as the Tethys closed, connected to the Mediterranean, and through it to the world ocean, only by a narrow strait. But the Black Sea is unlike almost any other sea because of what lies in its depths. Below a certain level, a couple of 100 meters down, the waters of the Black Sea are completely without oxygen, and they have been so for thousands of years. This is the largest body of oxygen-free water on the planet, a vast dark deep in which no oxygen-breathing creature can survive. And in that oxygen-free deep, a sinister chemistry takes hold. Bacteria that thrive without oxygen produce a chemical called hydrogen sulfide, the gas that gives rotten eggs their foul smell, and which is deadly poison to most complex life. And so the deep waters of the Black Sea are laced with hydrogen sulfide, a vast, dark, poison deep, a dead zone that fills most of the volume of the sea. Imagine it. A large sea with a thin surface layer of ordinary living water, full of fish and life, floating on top of an enormous dark deep that is entirely without oxygen, laced with poison, dead. Below a couple of 100 meters, there is nothing that we would recognize as ocean life. No fish, no swimming creatures, only the poisoned water and the bacteria that thrive in it. It is a sea with a living skin over a dead and poisoned body, one of the most eerie configurations of water anywhere on the planet. And this poisoned deep has a strange and haunting consequence. Because nothing lives in the oxygen-free deep, nothing decays there in the ordinary way, and things that sink into it can be preserved for extraordinary lengths of time. Ancient shipwrecks, sunk thousands of years ago, have been found on the floor of the Black Sea in remarkable states of preservation, their wooden timbers intact, protected by the very poison of the deep, ships from vanished civilizations lying perfectly preserved in the dark dead water. And there is one more unsettling story attached to the Black Sea, though it remains debated and uncertain, only a hypothesis as we understand it. Some scientists have proposed that in the relatively recent past, some thousands of years ago, the Black Sea underwent a sudden and catastrophic transformation. According to this idea, the Black Sea was once a smaller freshwater lake, cut off from the Mediterranean, its level far below that of the world ocean. And then, as the idea goes, the rising Mediterranean breached the barrier at the strait, and the salt water of the Mediterranean came pouring into the freshwater basin in a catastrophic flood, raising the level of the Black Sea, drowning the surrounding lowlands, and transforming the lake into the sea we know today. Some have wondered whether the memory of such a catastrophic flood, if it happened, might echo in the ancient flood myths that appear in so many cultures of the region. The idea is contested, and the evidence is debated, and we cannot say for certain that it happened as described. But it is one more strange and unsettling story attached to this strange and unsettling sea, one more way in which the remnants of the Tethys hold dark secrets in their depths. The Black Sea, with its vast poisoned deep, and its perfectly preserved ancient wrecks and its possible catastrophic flooding, is one of the eeriest legacies of the vanished Tethys. It is a reminder that the remnants of the great ocean are not ordinary seas, but strange and often disturbing bodies of water, holding poison and mystery in their depths. But to understand the Black Sea and the other strange inland remnants of the Tethys, we have to meet a lost sea that most people have never heard of, a vast vanished inland ocean that was itself born from the death of the Tethys, and that itself died in turn, breaking apart into the scattered dying seas we know today. It was called the Paratethys, and its story is one of the strangest in the whole strange tale of the vanished ocean. As the Tethys closed, as the continents drove together, and the great ocean was squeezed out of existence, the geography of the region grew complicated in ways that are still difficult to untangle. And one of the most remarkable consequences was the birth of a second lost sea, a vast inland body of water that formed to the north of the closing Tethys, cut off, over time, from the shrinking ocean and from the world sea beyond. Scientists call this lost inland sea the Paratethys, a name that means roughly beside the Tethys, and in its prime it was enormous, a great inland sea that stretched across much of what is now Central and Eastern Europe and Central Asia, from the region of the Alps all the way towards Central Asia, a sea in the heart of the continents. The Paratethys was a strange sea, and its strangeness came from its isolation. Because it was cut off, wholly or partly, from the world ocean, it was at the mercy of its own private balance of rivers and rainfall and evaporation, and its own connections, opening and closing, to the shrinking Tethys and the Mediterranean and the wider sea. And because of this isolation, the Paratethys underwent dramatic transformations across its history, changes in its level and its saltiness that were extreme and sometimes sudden. At times it was connected to the world ocean and filled with ordinary marine life. At other times it was cut off and grew brackish or strange, developing its own peculiar creatures found nowhere else, adapted to its unusual and shifting waters. And at times, as we understand it, it suffered great crises, times when its level dropped dramatically or its chemistry changed profoundly, killing off its life and transforming it into something new. There is evidence, for instance, that at certain times in its history, the Paratethys shrank catastrophically, its water level dropping by enormous amounts, so that this vast inland sea contracted into a fraction of its former extent, a great body of water diminishing toward a scatter of shrunken remnants. It was, in its own way, a rehearsal in miniature of the fate of the Tethys itself, an inland sea repeatedly transformed, shrinking and changing and reforming, at the mercy of the shifting geography and the private balance of its isolated waters. To imagine the Paratethys is to imagine a vast sea in the heart of the continents, endlessly changing, its shores advancing and retreating across enormous areas, its waters turning from marine to brackish and back, its strange creatures evolving in isolation, a whole lost world of water that most people have never heard of. And in the end, the Paratethys broke apart. As the land continued to rise and shift, as the great inland sea shrank and fragmented, it split into separate basins, isolated remnants of the once vast inland ocean. And those remnants are seas we know today. The Black Sea, with its poisoned deep, is a remnant of the Paratethys. The Caspian Sea, the largest inland body of water on the planet, is a remnant of the Paratethys. And other, smaller bodies of water across the region descend, as we understand it, from that same lost inland sea. The Paratethys, the great vanished inland ocean born from the death of the Tethys, itself died and broke apart, leaving behind the scattered dying seas that dot the map of Eastern Europe and Central Asia today. each one a shrunken survivor of a lost inland ocean that was itself a child of a lost greater ocean, vanished sea born from vanished sea, in a lineage of dying waters stretching back into deep time. There is something particularly haunting about the Paratethys, precisely because it is so little known, a vast lost sea that has been almost entirely forgotten, surviving only as a scatter of remnant waters, and as a subject of study for the scientists who reconstruct the vanished geography of the past. It is a reminder that the death of the Tethys was not a single simple event, but a long and complicated unraveling, giving rise to lost seas that themselves gave rise to lost seas, a cascade of vanishing waters across millions of years. And it leads us directly to the fate of those final remnants, the dying survivors of the Tethys and the Paratethys, which are shrinking and vanishing still, some of them before our very eyes. Let us consider the fate of the vanishing waters. The Tethys is gone, but it did not vanish all at once, and it did not vanish completely. It left behind a scatter of remnant seas, trapped bodies of water that are the last survivors of the great ocean. And here is one final unsettling truth about the Tethys. Those remnants are still dying. Slowly, and in some cases not so slowly, the last survivors of the Tethys are shrinking, drying, and vanishing. And in at least one case, we have watched it happen within a single human lifetime. The greatest of the remnant seas is the Mediterranean, the sea that dried up and refilled during the Messinian crisis, and that still lies in a warm, dry region where the sun evaporates more water than the rivers bring in. It survives only because of its connection to the Atlantic through the Strait of Gibraltar. Should that connection ever close again, as it did 6 million years ago, the Mediterranean would dry up once more. It is a sea living on borrowed time, dependent on a narrow gateway to the world ocean, a remnant of the Tethys that has already died once and could die again. Then there is the Black Sea, with its poisoned deep, and beyond it lies the Caspian Sea, which is the largest inland body of water on the entire planet, so large that it is called a sea, though it is entirely enclosed by land, a vast lake with no connection to the world ocean at all. The Caspian, too, is a remnant of the ancient seas left behind by the closing of the Tethys, descended, as we understand it, from a great inland sea called the Paratethys that formed as the Tethys closed. And the Caspian, cut off entirely from the world ocean, is at the mercy of the balance between the rivers that flow into it and the sun that evaporates it away. Its level rises and falls over time, and there are concerns that it too may be shrinking, its waters slowly diminishing, another remnant of the Tethys in slow decline. And then there is the most haunting example of all, a body of water that was, in the broadest sense, part of the great legacy of inland seas descended from the Tethyan realm, and that vanished not over millions of years, but within living memory, before the eyes of people alive today. It was the Aral Sea, in Central Asia, once one of the largest lakes in the world. And in the span of a few decades in the recent past, it very nearly disappeared. The rivers that fed it were diverted to irrigate crops, and deprived of their water, the Aral Sea shrank and shrank and shrank until most of it was gone, leaving behind a vast, dry, salt-crusted, poisoned desert where a great sea had been. Ships were left stranded on the dry seabed, rusting hulks sitting in the sand, miles from any water, a haunting image of a sea that had vanished. The disappearance of the Aral Sea in our own time is a modern echo of the ancient fate of the Tethys, a reminder that seas can vanish, that they are vanishing still, that the process which destroyed the great ocean of the ancient world is not confined to the deep past, but continues into the present day, sometimes with terrible speed. The vanishing waters, the shrinking remnants of the Tethys, are a living reminder of the impermanence at the heart of the ocean story. The great sea died, and its remnants are dying still, drying and shrinking and vanishing, some over millions of years, some within a single human lifetime. And this ongoing death is not without consequence for the wider world, because the closing of the Tethys, the death of the great ocean, did not only reshape the land and the seas, it reshaped the climate of the entire planet. And to that final consequence we now must turn. The death of the Tethys was not only a local event, confined to the region where the ocean once lay. It was a global event, one that reshaped the climate of the entire planet. And understanding this is one more reason the Tethys occupies such an important and unsettling place in the science of the Earth. Because when an ocean dies, when a great seaway closes, it does not only change the map, it changes the way the whole planet works. Recall that the Tethys, in its prime, wrapped around the tropical heart of the world, and that this allowed warm water to flow around the equator in a great circling current, a warm river in the sea that helped to distribute heat around the planet. This circumequatorial current was a major feature of the ancient climate system, helping to keep the world warm and mild. But as the Tethys closed, as the continents drove together and the ocean was consumed, this great current was disrupted. The pathway for warm water to flow around the tropics was cut. The continents, driving together, blocked the ancient circulation, and the flow of heat around the planet was rearranged. The consequences of this rearrangement were profound, and they contributed, as we understand it, to one of the great transformations of the Earth's recent climate history, the shift from the warm, ice-free world of the age of dinosaurs toward the cooler world of today, a world with great ice caps at the poles. The closing of the Tethys was one of a number of changes in the arrangement of the continents and the oceans that, together, reorganized the currents of the world and altered the flow of heat around the planet, contributing to a long-term cooling. As the ancient warm currents were disrupted and new patterns of circulation took their place, the world grew cooler, ice began to accumulate at the poles, and eventually the great cycles of ice ages began. The death of the Tethys was part of the story of how the world cooled, how the warm greenhouse planet of the dinosaurs gave way to the cooler, icier world in which we live. There is something profound in this, in the realization that the death of a single ocean could help to change the climate of the entire planet, could contribute to the cooling of the world and the coming of the ice ages. It reveals how deeply interconnected the systems of the Earth are, how the movement of the continents and the opening and closing of oceans shape the climate and the whole living world. The Tethys did not die in isolation. Its death sent ripples through the entire planet, reorganizing the currents of the oceans, altering the flow of heat, contributing to a transformation of the global climate that would help to produce the world we know. The vanished ocean shaped not only the mountains and the seas, but the very climate in which we live. And this, too, is part of why the Tethys unsettles the scientists who study it. Because it demonstrates that the great features of the planet, the oceans and the continents and the climate, are all bound together in a single vast system, and that a change in one can transform all the others. The death of an ocean can raise mountains and dry up seas and change the climate of the world. Nothing is isolated, nothing is permanent, and a shift in the slow movement of the continents can, over time, remake the entire planet. Let us now draw these threads together and confront directly the deepest source of the unease that the Tethys inspires. We have traced the whole story of the Tethys now, from its warm and living prime to its long and terrible death, and we can at last confront directly the question at the heart of our journey. Why does this vanished ocean still terrify, still unsettle the scientists who study it? The answer is not any single thing, but a gathering of truths, each unsettling in its own right, which together reveal something deeply disturbing about the nature of the world. The Tethys unsettles because it proves that an ocean can die. One of the greatest oceans in the history of the planet, a sea that wrapped around the heart of the world for hundreds of millions of years, was utterly destroyed, consumed by the collision of the continents, swallowed back into the earth. If such an ocean could vanish, then no ocean is permanent. The great seas of today, the Atlantic and the Pacific and the Indian, are not eternal. They too will one day close or open or be transformed as the continents continue their slow, relentless dance. The oceans we take for granted are temporary features of a changing world. The Tethys unsettles because it proves that mountains were seas and seas were deserts. The highest mountains on Earth are made from the floor of the vanished ocean, lifted into the sky. The bottom of the sea has become the roof of the world, and the western remnant of the ocean dried up into a burning desert kilometers below sea level, and then refilled in a catastrophic flood. If the roof of the world can be the bottom of a sea, if a sea can become a desert and then a sea again, then nothing about the surface of the planet is fixed. The mountains will fall, the seas will move. The map is an illusion of permanence over a reality of ceaseless change. The Tethys unsettles because its death is not over and it still kills. The collision that destroyed it is still underway, still raising mountains, still convulsing in earthquakes that level cities and kill thousands, still erupting in volcanoes that have buried cities and ended civilizations. The dying ocean reaches into the human world today through fire and earthquake, a present and continuing danger. And it unsettles because its remnants are strange and disturbing, poisoned dead seas and vanishing waters, some of them drying up within a single human lifetime before our eyes. And beneath all of these particular truths lies the deepest source of the unease, the thing that the Tethys whispers to those who truly understand it. It is the impermanence of the world itself. We live our lives on what feels like solid, permanent ground, beneath what feel like eternal skies, beside what feel like everlasting seas. We take the arrangement of the world, the continents and the oceans and the mountains, as a fixed and permanent stage on which our lives play out. But the Tethys reveals that this is an illusion. The ground is not solid, the seas are not eternal, the mountains are not permanent. Everything is in motion, slow and vast and unstoppable, and everything that seems permanent is only a passing arrangement, always being destroyed and remade. The Tethys is a memento mori not for a person, but for the world, a reminder that even the greatest and most seemingly permanent features of the planet are temporary, that everything in the fullness of time passes away. And that is a truth that can indeed inspire a kind of terror, a deep and vertiginous unease, in anyone who truly grasps it. And yet, as we will find as we come to the end of our journey, there is another way to see this truth, a way that transforms the terror into something closer to peace. But first, let us consider where the ghost of the Tethys is now, and how completely it still haunts the modern world. The Tethys is gone, destroyed, vanished from the face of the earth. And yet, in one of the strangest twists of its whole strange story, the Tethys is everywhere in the modern world. Its ghost haunts the continents and the seas and the mountains, and even the foundations of human civilization, so that we live, in a sense, surrounded by the remains of the vanished ocean, whether we know it or not. The ghost of the Tethys is in the mountains. The Alps, the Himalayas, the Zagros Mountains of Iran, the Atlas Mountains of North Africa, and many other ranges, are built in large part from the crushed and lifted sediments of the Tethys. the folded remains of its floor. When you look at these great mountain ranges, you are looking at the corpse of the vanished ocean, raised into the sky. The ghost of the Tethys is in the stone. The pale limestones that form so many of the world's mountains and quarries and buildings, the marble of countless monuments and cathedrals, were formed on the floor of the Tethys, from the reefs and shelled creatures of that warm ancient sea. The very stones of human civilization in many places are made from the remains of the Tethys. The ghost of the Tethys is in the seas. The Mediterranean, the Black Sea, the Caspian, are the last surviving remnants of the great ocean, dying survivors of a vanished world. When you swim in the Mediterranean, you are swimming in the last of the Tethys, a remnant of the ocean that once wrapped around the heart of the world. The ghost of the Tethys is in the deserts, in the whale skeletons of the Valley of the Whales, in the marine fossils scattered across arid lands that were once the floor of the sea. And the ghost of the Tethys is in the fossils on the mountain tops, the seashells at the summit of the world, the marine creatures whose remains were lifted from the ocean floor into the highest and coldest places on earth. And perhaps most consequentially of all, the ghost of the Tethys is in the very lifeblood of modern civilization, in its oil and its gas. For much of the world's petroleum, especially the vast reserves of the Middle East, was formed from the organic remains of the teeming life of the Tethys and its margins, the plankton and the creatures of that warm and living sea, buried and transformed over millions of years into the oil and gas that fuel the modern world. The energy that powers our cars and our cities and our civilization comes, in large part, from the dead bodies of the creatures of the Tethys, the remains of that vanished ocean, buried beneath the sands of the lands where the sea once lay. In a very real and startling sense, modern civilization runs on the ghost of the Tethys, on the transformed remains of a sea that vanished before humans existed. The Tethys, then, is not truly gone. It is transformed, scattered, hidden, woven into the mountains and the seas and the stones and the very energy of the modern world. It is a ghost, but a ghost that is everywhere, that shapes our world in countless ways, seen and unseen. And to live in the modern world is to live surrounded by the remains of the vanished ocean, whether we recognize them or not. The Tethys died, but it left its ghost upon the whole face of the earth. And now, as our long journey through the vanished ocean comes to its close, let us rise, one last time, and consider what this strange and unsettling story might mean for us, as we drift, at last, toward sleep. We have traveled the whole long story of the Tethys tonight, from its warm and living prime, full of monsters, through its long and terrible death, to the ghost it left upon the modern world. And we have confronted the deep unease it inspires, the vertiginous truth that oceans can die, that mountains were seas, that nothing about the world is permanent. It is, in many ways, a frightening story, a story that can unsettle even the scientists who devote their lives to understanding it. But as we come to the end, let us find, beneath the terror, a kind of peace, and let that peace carry us gently toward sleep. Because the impermanence that the Tethys reveals, frightening as it can be, is also, when you look at it another way, a source of deep calm. Yes, the oceans will die and the mountains will fall, and the map of the world will be remade, again and again, across the vast reaches of time. But this has always been so, and it will always be so, and there is a strange serenity in accepting it, in letting go of the illusion of permanence and simply resting in the great slow rhythm of the changing world. The Tethys was born, and it lived, and it died, and its death gave rise to mountains and seas and the very world we know. It was not a tragedy. It was simply the way of the world, the endless dance of the continents and the oceans, the ceaseless making and unmaking of the surface of the planet. And we are small and brief, and held within that great slow rhythm, and there is peace in knowing it. Consider that the water itself endures. The water that filled the Tethys did not vanish when the ocean died. It flowed into other seas, evaporated into clouds, fell as rain, ran through rivers back to the ocean, cycling and cycling through the world as it has for billions of years. The very water in the seas tonight, the water in the rain, the water in your own body, has cycled countless times through the world, and some of it, in some sense, once filled the warm and living Tethys, once held the great marine reptiles, once lapped against the ancient shores. The ocean died, but its water endures, flowing on through the endless cycle of the world, connecting the vanished Tethys to every sea and every raindrop and every living thing today. Nothing is truly lost. It is only transformed and carried on into the world that follows. And consider that from the death of the Tethys came so much of the beauty of the world we know. The great mountains, the Alps and the Himalayas, rose from its death. The Mediterranean, cradle of civilizations, is its remnant. The very stones of our cities and the energy of our world came from it. The death of the ocean was not only destruction, it was also creation, the raising of mountains, the shaping of new seas, the making of the world in which we live. Destruction and creation are bound together in the story of the Tethys, as they are bound together in the whole story of the earth, the endless dying and being reborn of the surface of the world. And there is a deep and ancient peace in that, in the knowledge that even the death of an ocean gives rise to new beauty, new mountains, new seas, new life. So let the terror of the Tethys become, now, something gentler, a quiet acceptance of the impermanence and the endless renewal of the world. Picture it, if you like, one last time, the warm and living ocean at the heart of the ancient world, its blue waters full of life, its monsters cruising the depths, its reefs shining in the tropical sun. And then let it go, gently, as all things must be let go, into the deep past, into the slow rhythm of the changing world. The Tethys lived, and the Tethys died, and from its death rose the mountains and the seas and the world we know, and its water flows on, through all the ages, into the rain and the rivers and the seas of tonight, and into you. The vanished ocean is at peace now, scattered and transformed across the whole face of the earth, its terror softened by the vast calm of geological time. And you, resting here, are held within that same great rhythm, the slow, endless dance of the world, the making and unmaking of oceans and mountains, the cycling of the ancient water through all the ages. There is nothing to fear in it. There is only the deep, slow, patient turning of the world, carrying everything gently onward, carrying the ghost of the Tethys, and carrying you now not into terror but into rest. The ancient water rocks gently beneath you. The light fades softly toward the dark. The vanished ocean is far away now, in the deep past, its terror dissolved into the calm of deep time. And the water, the eternal water, the same water that once filled the warm Tethys and fills all the seas of today, flows on quietly beneath the stars, patient and deep and calm, carrying you now gently into rest. Sleep well.